Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 281 of the Medieval Podcast. I'm Danièle Cybulskie, also known as the 5-Minute Medievalist. Before we begin, I just want to take a second to thank all of the people who sent emails and left nice comments about last week's episode. I'm very happy to hear that you found it useful, and I hope that you continue to find the tools that I shared useful, especially as things continue to heat up on the global stage. Thank you to the Americans who specifically wrote to tell me that they support Canada. We do see you, I promise. And it is going to take all of us to turn the ship around. So let's continue together to be the change we want to see in the world. Last week, I talked about monks, mostly in the European Christian Latinate tradition, but naturally, there were a whole lot of monks in different traditions across the medieval world, just as there are today. And some of them were even poets. This week, I spoke with Dr. Thomas J. Mazanec about the Buddhist poet monks of medieval China. Tom is Associate Professor of Premodern Chinese and Comparative Literature at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and he's the author of many works on Chinese literature. He's also the East Asia Section Editor for the Journal of the American Oriental Society and the Acting Director of Translation Studies at UCSB's Comparative Literature program. His new book is Poet Monks: The Invention of Buddhist Poetry in Medieval China. Our conversation on Buddhism in China, why monks used poetry as a medium, and why this art form was so controversial is coming up right after this. Welcome, Tom, to talk about Buddhist poet monks. This is very exciting for me because I have an interest in both Buddhism and monks, and I have never learned about this in terms of medieval studies before. So it is a pleasure to meet you. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks. A pleasure to be here.
Okay, so I think we need to kind of start way at the beginning when it comes to this topic, because I think a lot of people may not be familiar with China. Like, we're starting to get more stuff in English, as you'll know, which is awesome, but most of us don't have background in that so far. So let's start there. When we're talking about Buddhists in China, and especially the stuff that you're talking about here, mostly the Tang Dynasty, right? So when are we talking about?
Yeah, so Buddhism enters China around the start of the Common Era. There's some evidence there might have been some merchants who came in the 1st century BC, but the first firm evidence is from the 1st century CE. And then it gradually becomes sort of part of the cultural landscape, of course, coming from India. And by the time we get to the Tang Dynasty, which is my focus, that's 618 to 907. So I focus mainly on the second half of that dynasty and then the period of sort of collapse following the end of the dynasty.
So when we're talking about how Buddhism has entered China and it's spreading around, how much are we talking about? It's not the majority at this point. What sort of percentage of people would you say are practicing or familiar with Buddhism at this point? I know it's a big question. Can you guess?
Yeah, it's challenging to sort of estimate that precisely simply because of the nature of scattered historical record and that sort of thing. In the introduction, I do mention, this is chapter 1, in terms of the sheer number of Buddhists. One way we can estimate this is by looking at the number of Buddhist clergy per households. So in the years 713 to 755 or so, there's about 15 or 18 monks per 1,000 households. And then by the time we get to the mid-9th century, it's about 73 per 1,000 households. And by comparison, I note in chapter 1 how in the US, in the 2010 census, there's about 3 or 4 clergy per every 1,000 households of all varieties, not just Catholic or Protestant, but Buddhists and Jewish and Islamic. Yeah.
Wow, so that's actually quite a lot of monks per person in China. Okay, so when we're talking about these clergy, where are they coming from? Do you get the sense that they're coming from all strata of society, or are they mostly the upper classes? Where are these people coming from to join a monastery?
Yeah, you have all sort of classes of people. So one of the things that's interesting is that on the one hand, religious institutions were the sort of pathway to literacy and education. So some of the poet monks that I describe in the book were orphans who were raised in a monastery and learned to read and write there. On the other hand, you do have examples of monks who come from elite families. So there's one from the mid-8th century named Jiaoran, who traces lineage back to a very famous, powerful aristocratic family. And 10 generations ago, one of the most famous poets in the tradition is sort of his ancestor. So we do know that monks who came from elite families continue to keep ties with their birth families. In fact, they didn't really sever all ties with their birth families. On the other hand, we do have examples, as I mentioned, of sort of lower class or orphaned monks who are raised in the monastery and gained literacy that way.
Well, it's an important question to begin with, in that we're talking about literacy, we're talking about poetry, and your book is literally called The Invention of Buddhist Poetry, which means that it's not existing before now. So let's turn for a second to what the poetic landscape looks like at this point, just before we start to bring these two things together. So what does this look like when it comes to poetry in China? Who are the poets? What are they writing about? And who are they writing for?
Yeah, that's a great question. So sort of stepping back, taking a big picture approach, one of the earliest classics, Confucian classics, is called the Shijing, sometimes translated as the Book of Odes or the Classic of Poetry. And this is a set of songs that were, some of which were probably folk songs originally, collected by literate people and written down, and others were probably written at court for ceremonies and rituals and things like that. And so this is compiled probably over about a 600-year period from about 1000 BC to about 400 or 300 BC. And then there's a few other anthologies from that pre-imperial period, but there's no authors associated with these poems, basically. They're kind of anonymous, but used in different ways. And then by the time we get to around the turn of the Common Era, we have examples of writers, elite writers, sort of imitating these and writing their own versions of poems or odes, or basically like this. We have this sort of liminal period around between the start of the Common Era to around the year 200 or so. And then when you get to the early 3rd century, you have a very prominent example of a circle of friends who are writing elite poetry. And they're kind of often seen as the start of the individual poet as this sort of tradition. Interestingly enough, this group called the Seven Masters of the Jianan period, Jianan is the reign era that they lived in. About half of them died in a pandemic that happened in the year 217. And so there's this whole sense of nostalgia around their poetic output that's right there at the very heart of the tradition. So in this way, then, poetry becomes very associated with elite culture. And in pre-modern China, that means people who become literate and they want to serve. Their highest goal is to serve in government office and sort of help run the state. And so one of the ways they can do that is also around this time period. The Han Dynasty, which had lasted for 400 years, falls in about the year 220 or so. And then there's a sort of period of disunion until the end of the 6th century. And so in this period of disunion, things develop. But by the time we get to the end of the 6th century with the new unified dynasty called the Sui, which precedes the Tang, there's this civil service examination. So you're tested and recruited for civil service. And one of the main things they test is poetry composition, in fact. So it becomes a super important skill for anyone who wants to become an officer of the state. And so it's almost like if to become a civil servant in the US, you'd have to write sonnets about foreign policy or something like that. It's this very specific skill that people have to cultivate.
It's so interesting to imagine such a thing. We were talking about Korea a few weeks ago and the exams that you'd have to take to be part of the court and an elite part of the court. But it is such a different thing to imagine taking exams in poetry, for example, to get your position in government. Especially at this moment, we're thinking a lot about qualifications and that kind of thing, right? So Leaving that aside, people are writing poetry as part of their official job, and people are writing poetry at elite levels. And I think we can assume people are writing poetry at the pub and on the bathroom stall kind of thing as well.
Yeah. Poetry is also a social art in pre-modern China. So anytime you would visit a friend, you would exchange poems. There was a tradition of parting poetry. So if a friend visited me here in Santa Barbara, and then they were going to go on to the next thing, and they're going to go on whatever, horseback or whatever, to the next town over, let's say LA. The tradition would be I would go with them a mile or two, basically. And then when I finally said goodbye, we would exchange poems of parting. And I would say, oh, how sad I was and how I hope, you have success at your destination, all this stuff. People also send poems as sort of cards that accompanied gifts too. People, they wrote poems that they would send in letters. There were poems that people would submit to the emperor or the people higher up to sort of prove their literacy. They would also send poems to potential patrons as well to show off their literacy. There was a practice too in the Tang Dynasty of if you were going to take the civil service examinations, they weren't anonymized. And so one of the strategies that people had was to arrive at the capital, a year early, a few months early, circulate their collection of poetry among the elites and the potential examiners, and sort of get word out about, oh, this guy's an awesome poet, like kind of prime the pump, right? Get your reputation going. So poetry is used for all these kinds of things. Yeah.
I love that. Both the whole taking your friend along the journey for a bit and having sort of a ceremonial moment. I love that. Right now, we're just like, see you later.
Yeah.
That's all you get.
Right.
Which is not a poem in itself, for sure. But then also the idea of building your reputation, making sure people know about this. Okay, so this is the culture that we have the Buddhists coming into or growing their religion within China, within this
Mhm.
culture. So then the Buddhists get involved and they start to write poetry. So who's starting to write these early poems?
That's a great question. So I want to be clear that when I say the invention of Buddhist poetry, I mean this in the sense of like T.S. Eliot called Ezra Pound the inventor of Chinese poetry for our time, right? He didn't really invent Chinese poetry, but he invented what it meant in that era. And so these Buddhist monks that I write about in the Tang Dynasty, there were predecessors, other monks who wrote poetry a few centuries before. However, they didn't really identify as Buddhists writing poetry per se, right? The kind of the Buddhist identity and the poetic identity were often quite separate. And so it was really starting in the mid 8th century that you start to see Buddhist monks really take up this term poet monk, shisheng in Chinese, and use it. And what I trace in the book, in the first half of the book, is how when this is first used, it's kind of a label used to marginalize these people, saying, okay, poetry is the proper activity of like a Confucian who's trying to go for that good job in government and stuff. You monks, that's not what you do. Why are you doing this, basically? So you're just poet monks, right? You're monks play acting as poets, basically. You should be off meditating or communing with nature or advancing the Dharma and all this kind of stuff. Poetry is not your proper activity. There's a sort of paradoxical relationship in Buddhist scriptures about this too. On the one hand, Buddhist monks were allowed 2 hours a day for so-called external studies, 外学, meaning things that were not the study of Buddhist things. On the other hand, there was prescriptions against ornate language in the Buddhist scriptures saying you shouldn't, use ornate language. Your language should be plain. And so there's this kind of paradoxical place. So anyway, in the mid 8th century, this is following this enormous rebellion that almost brings the Tang Dynasty to its knees, and millions of people die. And so there's this moment of questioning what culture is and cultural reinvention that's happening in the late 8th century. And these poet monks, the first generation, are part of that rethinking of what culture can be.
Right. I think it's so important to get into why they might be picking up the pen of a poet at this moment, because there is a lot of pushback from inside the monastery, and then there's a lot of pushback from outside the monastery. So, I was wondering and reading the book, well, where is this compulsion coming from? And this is one of the things that you mentioned in the book. You can't be a historical mind reader, but it is very tempting to try and figure out where these people are coming from, which is what brought me to the question, are they coming from an elite family where they're like so immersed in poetry that they want to bring this to their new life, or is it flowering from here? And so one of the things that you're mentioning now is that there is a sense that this is part of rebuilding culture in the face of disaster.
Yeah, exactly. And what's interesting is following this huge rebellion, a bunch of the elites moved to the southeast area of China called known as Jiangnan. And this is where Hangzhou and Suzhou is and kind of near Shanghai. And so this area becomes this kind of secondary cultural center because a lot of elites moved there. And at the same time, Buddhism is really flourishing there. There's a huge Buddhist culture that goes way back centuries at this point. And so these two things kind of meet, right? This is also where tea appreciation culture comes from. It's the same historical moment, same historical place. And we have actually examples of verses, what are called linked verses. So this would be like if I wrote 2 lines of poetry and then you wrote 2 lines of poetry and then we put them all together and that's a new poem. So we have example of people writing linked verses that include these really important calligraphers and cultural figures and officials, but also Buddhist monks and even Taoist priests too at the same time. So you have this great sort of blending of cultural positions and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a surprise to see people being creative and just exercising those muscles, creating something that is beautiful, especially in a culture that reveres poetry as an important part of culture. So, as these poems are starting to come about, what is the purpose of them? Is the purpose of these poems, do you find from reading them, tend to be beauty in itself or teaching?
I think as this poetic tradition develops, we start to see that there's kind of both goals. There are aesthetic goals and there are didactic goals that these people have. So on the one hand, a lot of the poetry gets labeled as something that is meant to entice, or even the word almost is like can almost be translated as seduce, right? The audience. You bring them in with the beauty of the poetry, and then you get them to listen to your message, right? And then become a good Buddhist practitioner or something like that. But on the other hand, there is some evidence that the poet monks themselves didn't see this as their only goal. They saw poetry itself also as an end in itself too. And so there's a monk, Jiaoran, who I describe in chapter 2, who presents himself differently to different audiences, right? So when he's writing to certain people, he mentions this kind of, oh yeah, I'm trying to get people in with the Dharma and all that sort of stuff. On the other hand, he also, when he recommends another poet monk to a potential patron, he says, look, this guy's a good companion to have around. He can tell you about the Dharma. He can write poetry with you when you go on outside. He can help you write letters, all this sort of stuff. So like, this guy is kind of a jack of all trades. And then on other times, this Jiaoran is like guilty about his impulse to write poetry all the time. And he describes it as like the lingering effects of karma from a previous life that he can't help but write poetry. And it's something to be got rid of. So they have very complicated attitudes toward the writing of poetry, in fact.
Yeah, I mean, this doesn't seem too different from the idea of wanting to create something beautiful if you're a Christian monk and then being like, oh, am I thinking too much about the beauty of this when I really should be thinking about religion instead? So yeah, I can see that tension in maybe comparing it to the Christian monks that are more familiar to our listeners. Maybe that is a place where they could sort of see this happening. Yeah, I was wondering about this because it's very much a part of other missionary activities in different religions at different times, making something beautiful, making it rhyme, making it enticing, as you say, to teach people and get them interested. So can we, because you do this in the book, have a small crash course what the Buddhist monks who are trying to bring people into their religion want to get across? So what are some of the tenets that are super important in this poetry that get Buddhism across to the audience? This is a big question.
Yeah, let me think about that one. I guess the way I try to answer this question maybe is framed a little bit differently. And that is, rather than seeing what is the message they're trying to get across, like how the monks' religious practices inform their poetry or shape their poetry.
You said that much better than I did.
Oh, no. I'm just trying to think about how I framed it in the book. In the second half of the book, I identify 3 religious practices that inform their poetry and how they practice poetry. And these are, on the one hand, a kind of verbal repetition that's associated with a certain kind of scholarly discourse that features negation heavily. So Buddhists, of course, if you know anything about Buddhism, right, one of the goals is achieving nirvana, right? Nirvana means the snuffing out, literally extinction. So Buddhist, the highest truths are often expressed in negative terms, similar to like the via negativa in European theology. So this habit of negating things, that the Buddha is not this, it's not that, it's not that, creates this kind of repetition, which then we see in the monks' poetry shapes the rhythms and stuff of their poems. And I can go in much more detail about that if you want later. And then the second practice I focus on is incantation. So this is this recitation of spells and scriptures. So this is a very widespread practice. It's one of the most common ways that people would have heard Buddhist texts. And so monks themselves were experts in reciting texts. And poetry at this time, too, was not something you just wrote down on a page or on a door or whatever. It was also something that was commonly recited out loud and performed for people. And so I argue in that chapter that the way practices of recitation and music and sound and stuff informed how they wrote their poetry as well. And then the final practice I focus on is meditation. The sort of intense concentration to the natural world is something that informs both meditative practices and poetic practices. And so a later poet monk from the period of their flourishing in the early 10th century describes these as 2 gates to the same goal, basically.
Right. So I wanted to ask this question because what you started to notice was that when you tried to, or when the poet monks tried to bring these 2 things together, religion and poetry, people were not super into it because they're like, oh, this is too religious, so it's not good poetry, or this is too poetic, so it's not religious enough. And it made me think about those memes you see online where the youth pastor tries to be very cool and it just, it just fails. And so this is kind of what it reminded me of, in that the people who were at the top of poetic criticism or understanding poetry in the tradition outside of Buddhism at this moment are thinking it's too religious, it's not beautiful for those reasons. And so do you think that the way that we have incantation, we have the practice of meditation or building meditation into it and that repetition, do you think that's the problem that people had with it?
I don't think that those things per se were what people had a problem with. I think it was like kind of the stay in your lane kind of approach. You're monks, and there you have a critic, Bai Jui, who's this really famous poet and statesman from the early 9th century. He has the largest surviving collection of any Tang poet, and he himself became a devout Buddhist late in his life. But despite, or even you could say because of that devotion, he wrote this thing for a monk friend of his, a poet monk friend of his, and said, look, this is one of the good guys. He actually writes for the sake of the Dharma. These other poet monks, they're too focused on literature. They're too focused on the poetics. They're too focused on, beauty per se. And that's not right. And so we really want to be like this guy named Dao Zong, who writes for the sake of the Dharma and for liberation and all that kind of stuff.
So what characterizes these poems? What makes them so great? Is it that they're so minimalist and focus on that subject, or because the words that are being used are not flowery? Do you see what I'm saying? It's very hard to describe these things.
Yeah, basically, he's saying that it's serving its proper purpose. So the thing you got to remember at this time is that most poets, even the ones who were not Buddhist, did not see poetry as an end in itself. I mean, some certainly did value the beauty, of course, and there's all kinds of things that they valued about it. But there's this sort of Confucian moralistic approach to poetry, saying poetry should be in service of these greater goods, of praising what is good, condemning what is bad, criticizing corruption, upholding the proper order, that sort of thing. So Confucians themselves didn't see poetry as being something for its own sake. So when these Confucian officials would praise Buddhists who wrote poetry, they would say, okay, now you're using it for your Buddhist ends, your didactic ends. That's fine. That's what poetry should be. Poetry should be a tool.
So as you see this start to spread, it starts to spread from the one corner of China to everywhere and at court. Do you see that the people identifying as both poets and monks, do you find them joining the ranks of the elite as Buddhists first or as poets first? What do you think?
Certainly, you have examples of both, I would say. So you have some who use their poetry to sort of cozy up to rulers and then kind of get patronage that way, or find ways of getting those rulers or those elites to sort of sponsor monastery repair projects and all these sorts of things. You have examples of monks who become well known as poets and then get invited to court for that. And then when they're there, they're able to advance either their literary goals or their religious goals. You also have some examples of monks, especially this is during the period of the collapse of the Tang Dynasty, as the different regions are becoming independent states, monks who go to these different areas and sort of try to find a home for themselves. They try to find a patron because they just want to be safe from all the chaos that's happening. And so using their poetry is one way to get that patronage.
And when we're talking about people criticizing, saying this isn't good poetry because it's too religious, do you think that this idea of using poetry for patronage just to make a living is part of that criticism that they get from the Buddhist side of things, where there is a criticism, I think, that you mentioned throughout the book, where people are like, if you are using poetry to get paid, then you're not a good Buddhist.
Yeah. Certainly there is that criticism, right? And one of my articles that's not in this book, but I have an article out about money. It's called Money, Merit, and Meter. And so these are basically three forms of currency that I see in this sort of landscape. So obviously money is something that's exchangeable. Merit, like the good merit you accrue from doing religious deeds, like what we would call good karma in American. And then meter, right? Poetry is also a thing that's meant to be exchanged. And sometimes these things are fungible. So you can write a poem and get paid for it, right? You can write a poem to fulfill a debt. Sometimes poetry is used to accrue religious merit as well. Yeah, and so this world is out there, but there are critics of it. And especially as we get after the period that my book focuses on in the subsequent dynasty, the Song dynasty, a lot of the Buddhist institutions become more formalized, and there are a lot more rules that get developed around this and sort of criticize these practices.
Yeah. We were mentioning before that there's always this tension between, are you too worldly? Are you not worldly enough to get fed? You have to walk that fine line if you're going to be both poet and monk. And I was also thinking, as we were talking about this, one of the things that you mentioned that really informs this poetry is incantation, because there is this
Mm.
idea that understanding these works, not just poetic works, but other works that in the Buddhist tradition will give you some protection, will help you within the world. And I'm wondering if you think that bringing a poet monk to court might be a way of just hedging your bets in a tough time. Do you think that maybe people are hoping that a poet monk will compose something for them that will help them in sort of supernatural ways?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. There's widespread evidence that in this period, rulers patronized different religious traditions and often would patronize competing religious traditions precisely for the reason you mentioned. They're trying to hedge their bets, right? Okay, if the Buddhists are right, I want to have a lot of good karma and like patronizing this and printing scriptures and sponsoring monks and all this sort of things. If the Taoists are right, I want their wizards and their, magical powers and stuff. And these religions at times competed for patronage, but at times they sort of cooperated as well. So it really depends on the different eras we're in. Famously, in the year 845 or so, there's this suppression of Buddhism and other so-called foreign religions. There's a certain emperor who becomes really obsessed with Taoism, but he needs to like get more funds for the state. And so one of the things they do is they close down all these sort of so-called foreign religions, kind of drawing on these what we would call nationalist sort of sentiments or kind of ethno-nationalist sentiments, using it as a pretext to kind of seize all this property from Buddhists and stuff. I mean, a few years later, the next emperor reverses this policy and starts rebuilding everything, but there were those sentiments around.
Well, I think that there are so many reasons. Again, we can't like be historical mind readers, but when you come to a complex topic like this, there are all sorts of reasons why you might be pulling in a monk to sort of hedge your bets in this world or the next world or your next reincarnation, perhaps. And I'm wondering, one other thing I want to ask about is in terms of becoming a poet monk within a court context is, do you see examples of these Buddhists who are there to create Buddhist poetry being pressured into creating praise poetry? Because we do find a lot of court poets in other contexts that are there because they're commissioned to write great things about the leader. Do you find that this is a context that also applies to poet monks?
Oh, for sure. One of the key figures in my study is a monk named Guanxiu who lived from 832 to 913. So this is right in this period of the collapse of the Tang Dynasty. And so he's from that southeast area where the poet monk tradition kind of springs up. And so when the Tang starts collapsing, at this point, he's already had a pretty full life. He's, 60 years old or something like that. He goes to one of the regional rulers and says basically, hey, can you offer me patronage? Like, can I hang out here? And he presents this poem where he says, oh, your gleaming sword shines over the 14 prefectures. You control these 14 prefectures. And the ruler says, okay, you got to change 14 to 40 because that's how ambitious I am, right? And then Guanxiu, the monk, says, well, poems, just like territory, are hard to change, so no. And then he gets kicked out, right? He has to wander throughout the collapsing empire for another decade or so. But then, so he seems like this guy has high principles and stuff. But then when he goes to the southwest, now Sichuan province, and there's a different regional ruler there who's kind of has his reputation for being like this illiterate and kind of ignorant guy. But then we see lots of praise poems that this guy Guanxiu writes for him, and it works. He gets sponsored. He gets a whole huge monastery built for him. He gets tons of disciples, and then when he dies, he gets buried in this really grand manner. So yeah, so poets certainly, on the one hand, the poet monks would resist that kind of compromise, but other times they strategically wrote poetry of flattery.
It's interesting because you see this all over history, right? Where people are like,
Yeah.
oh, how much do I need to sell out for the greater good? Is it worth it? Especially, in contexts which you think are supposed to be ultimately religious and have hard lines about things. There's always more flexibility than we tend to see.
Yeah.
So you have some examples in here about people embracing the life of poetry because it is difficult and fighting off these impulses, as you were saying before, to write poetry, calling it a demon. So can you talk to us a little bit about the difficulty and why people might embrace poetics or writing poetry as difficult because it helps them in their spiritual practice?
There was this trope that emerged around the ninth century known as the poetry demon, and it's a way of describing this impulse to write verse. And there's actually another great book on Buddhist poetry in the subsequent dynasty called the Song, and my friend Jason Protas wrote that, and it's called The Poetry Demon, precisely. He names his book after this. But things are a little different in the next dynasty, so I'll leave, he can talk about that sometime. But in the Tang dynasty, what you have at the end of the ninth century, early 10th century, you have this phenomenon of asceticism, basically, a kind of literary asceticism. Asceticism, of course, has long been associated with Buddhism, right? Like the Buddha had a period of asceticism. Many of his followers were ascetics and denied themselves pleasure. And so what you have is possibly based on this Buddhist monastic model, poets who embrace suffering and they suffer for their arts. So you have this figure who kind of becomes the embodiment of this, who's a guy named Jiadao. And he actually was raised in a monastery and was a monk until he was in his 20s. And then he was convinced to leave and try to pursue an official career. But he carried with him this ideal, right, of literary asceticism. And it was known in the Chinese tradition as kuyin. It's called like bitter intoning or painful chanting or something like that. And this became a kind of widespread literary phenomena where lots and lots of poets portrayed themselves this way as willing to suffer for their art. And what's interesting about this phenomenon is that it's almost a democratizing movement. Like anyone, if you put in hard work, can become a good poet, basically, is one of the core assumptions of this idea, this opens up the path for monks to become poets, for women to be poets, for people from lower classes to become poets as well. It's not just for the elites.
It's interesting for two reasons to me. One, because the accusation that gets flung at a lot of these poet monks is that you're becoming too worldly and it's going to lead to just all sorts of sinning, like too much wine and too much partying. And it's interesting because at the same time, people are seeing poetry as being very difficult and ascetic, and that is why they're choosing it, which sort of brings me back around to the idea that we were talking about at the beginning, like who is in the monastery and who is going to be picking up literacy and who's going to be embracing that. So as we were talking about this spreading not only to the court, but also to other Buddhist monasteries, who do we find starting to write? Are we finding this to be sort of a practice that's almost formalized or just totally informal? Just this monk feels like writing poetry and they write it? Or is it something that is starting to be taught?
It is something that starts to be taught and it becomes a sort of self-conscious tradition. So on the one hand, you do have monks who study poetry with non-monastic poets. So one of the main monks in my study, Qiji, studies under a literati poet named Zhenggu. So he learns from him and he credits him as his teacher in poetry. At the same time, one of the other main monks, Guanxiu, who I mentioned earlier about it's hard to change poems in states, he has disciples like such as this guy, Tan Yu, whose collection doesn't survive, but we know it was like thousands of poems long. He was this very erudite guy. So you have also the monk to monk lineages as well of poetry. And we see examples, which I mentioned in chapter 3 of the book, of monks coming to visit the well-known poet monks to kind of inherit their teaching or get taught by them in poetry. And so there becomes this sort of self-conscious tradition. At the same time, it was a common practice for elite writers who weren't monks to go to monasteries to write their own poetry, to exchange. Some of these monasteries were like mountain retreats, there was like lots of activities to do there, lots of places to write your inscriptions and to have good conversation and good food or whatever. So it wasn't just monks that were in these monasteries, but also secular writers, what we would call secular writers.
And do you find that when this tradition is building of writing within the monastery and in some ways for the monastery, do you find that this is training to become a better monk, or do you find that this is also training so that you can try to take your exams maybe and become an advisor to the emperor? In that sometimes in the Christian tradition, which is perhaps more familiar to our listeners, we have people who are going to get their education, and their education is tooled for this express purpose of becoming an advisor to somebody above them. So do you find that this is an insular thing or that it's sort of tailored towards ambition?
There are kind of both ways of looking at it, I would say. So we have evidence from some of the rule books that come a couple centuries after the period I focus on that say, okay, why is writing good? Well, it's good to be a good writer because then you can communicate better and you can also get the ear of the rulers and all this kind of stuff, and you can have good relations with the state. And then also the other evidence we see is I mentioned before that poetry was a social activity, it was exchanged. So one of the things I did for this book and for an earlier article was catalog all these exchange poems, not just with the monks, but from everyone from this period, from about the year 830 or so to the year 960. And I created a big network map and used all kinds of social network analysis. And what I found was that, first of all, the network changed over time. But as we get to this period of the poet monk in the late 9th century, that these monks are kind of at the center of these networks. They're very well connected, both to other monks, but also to the poets who were not monks. And this is very different from a couple centuries later when the monastic literary exchanges are all taking place between monks, pretty much. There's far less contact with the outside world.
So as we get near the end of our time, you've noticed that in looking back on the legacy of the monks from the poet monks from this particular period, people are still kind of ambivalent. There's some people who are super harshly critical. So what do you find is the legacy of these poet monks from this moment in time?
I see it as kind of an interesting road not taken. So basically, these Buddhist monks had this vision at this time of creating a kind of Buddhist monastic poetic tradition, right? Where one could be fully a poet and fully a monk at the same time. Historical conditions change, and basically the style of poetry they wrote fell out of favor in the next century. And then also the next century saw the rise of Neo-Confucianism as an intellectual movement, and Neo-Confucianism was very exclusive. And so they basically saw, no, we're not Buddhists, and we don't want to have anything to do with Buddhism. And that Neo-Confucianism ended up becoming state ideology, and that shaped the rest of the imperial period up through 1911, basically. And so the difficulty of doing this research is that our lens for understanding literary history is shaped by these later critics that were Neo-Confucians, right? And so they have this bias against Buddhist monks. And so what the book tried to do was try to go back to the source materials, take away these stereotypes, and sort of see, okay, what do the Buddhist monks themselves think they were doing, right? How do they see themselves? Let's not see them through the eyes of a later critic. I quote a few that have some sort of spicy language in the introduction, like who says, the flavor of meditation in a poem is like the taste of a shit stick, right? One of these sort of things that you wipe up with, or that the monastic is one of 4 types of bad poetry, right? That the others are like school teacher and like being too effeminate and all this kind of stuff. So you have this very patriarchal Neo-Confucian tradition that's also somewhat suspicious of foreigners and outsiders. And so I really was hoping that by seeing what the poet monks themselves thought about what they were doing, that we can kind of get around some of these biases and see what were other possibilities at the time, even if they never became the mainstream.
Mm-hmm. I think that you've looked at it in a way that is very subtle. I think that you can get at so many different things by looking at these poems. And because I know that you're enthusiastic about this, I'm going to give you a second to tell us, what is the worth of looking at these poems? What do they say to us? What can we learn from these poems? Why do you love them so much?
I think this is sort of embodied in some of especially the kind of landscape poems and this sort of thing. So a lot of poems feature lines that describe the natural landscape. And classical Chinese poetry in general, I think, presents a pretty unique way of viewing landscape. There's a thing in classical Chinese poetry where you have to have parallelisms. So this is similar, actually, in some ways to like the Psalms of the Hebrew Bible. If you have in line 1, if the first word is heaven, in line 2, the first word should be earth. If it's, heaven stirs, in line 2, it should be the earth responds or something like that. And so this sort of vision of seeing the world around us, the cosmos of us, is having these sort of resonances and these sorts of parallels is a very powerful way of seeing meaning in the world. And what the Buddhist poet monks did was took this and saw resonances with some of their doctrine, some of their practices in Buddhism. So this way of sort of crafting careful attention to the world around us is something that reading poetry in general, but especially classical Chinese poetry, and I'd argue even more narrowly, Buddhist classical Chinese poetry, helps us do.
Well, that is beautiful. And that is exactly what I was hoping for you to tell us, is just why these things are so beautiful. Sometimes it's hard to articulate, but you have done an absolutely wonderful job of telling us why we should read this and why we should keep reading this, and especially add it to our education about the Middle Ages. So thanks so much, Tom, for coming on and telling us about Buddhist poet monks in China.
Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.
To find out more about Tom's work, you can visit his faculty page at the University of California, Santa Barbara. His new book is Poet Monks, The Invention of Buddhist Poetry in Medieval China. Before we go, here's Peter from Medievalist.net to tell us what's on the website. What's going on, Peter?
Hey. So this week we're going back to the earliest part of the early Middle Ages, the year 406. And that was supposedly when the crossing of the Rhine happened.
Okay.
Yes. And so this is apparently one of the key events of the fall of the Roman Empire, or the Western Roman Empire. And it's said that a bunch of Germanic tribes on December 31st, 406, crossed the Rhine and started wreaking havoc all over Gaul, all over present-day France and Switzerland and things like that, causing trouble.
All right.
As the Visigoths are known to do, right?
Well, you tell me, because it sounds like there's something coming up after this intro that you've just set up.
Indeed. There's been new research done. It was by a historian named Matthias Fafinski, and he does this piece looking at the main piece of evidence for this crossing. And it's a letter by St. Jerome, a well-known Christian writer from the 5th century. And a couple years after the supposed event, he writes this widow in Gaul and says, look at all the terrible things that are happening here. He says it so he tells her she shouldn't get remarried. So he lays all that out. And Fafinski kind of looks at it and says, well, first of all, Jerome's not a very good historian. He has this kind of allergy to the truth. Just overall. And he's writing a polemic and things like that. And moreover, he's not in a very good position to know what's happening in Gaul at the time because he's actually living in Bethlehem in the Near East.
Yeah, those are kind of far apart.
Yeah, I'm surprised other historians haven't picked up on these apparent flaws in Jerome's work. But if you look at it and you kind of think that maybe he was making stuff up, which he might have been. All the other evidence for this Rhine crossing is pitiful.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, this seems like something that is going to stir some debate.
Yeah, I've already kind of seen a little bit of debate happening, but yeah, it's something that's like all those history books that are out there, like, have that crossing of the Rhine. Well, you may have to edit your books a bit.
Well, I mean, this is why we have to keep looking and re-looking at the sources to make sure we're not just putting stuff in history books unless it's well supported. So I guess everyone's going to have to read this article and see what they think.
Indeed. So we have that piece as well as a link to the actual article, which is open source. We also have our list of the 10 open access articles from February. It's like something we do every month. I love actually doing it, going in and looking for it. Worth checking out, especially there's a new piece about whether or not the plague, aka the Black Death, hit Baghdad in the year 1258 when the Mongols conquered the city.
Right. Speaking of debates, right? This is one that keeps going.
Yeah. This is I think the third article looking at it. So it's those interesting little debates that you can get your teeth into.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, we've got that on the website as well.
Awesome. And so this is for everyone to access? Everyone can access these open source articles?
Indeed. We always create this list. We put our top 10 on the website, and then the others that we found, and we found 47 this month, they all go on our Patreon for our Patreon members.
Exactly. If you are a patron, you get even more open access articles at your fingertips. And finally, you said that you have a really cool article that's come out on Medievalist.net that I need to know more about. Tell us about it.
Yes, Laura Chevalier takes a look at an interesting medieval tale, and it involves a battle that takes place where they were using rotten apples and fresh cheese as weapons.
That is such a shame. That's a tragic waste of cheese, if you ask me.
I think the participants were happy not to be using swords and arrows. But.
Well, when you put it that way, I suppose it's better than using swords. But still, what a waste of cheese. All right. Well, thank you, Peter, for coming on and telling us everything about what's on the website. Thanks. Thank you to everyone who continues to support this podcast and all of my work in the little ways and the big ways, by not skipping the ads, by telling all your friends about your favorite episodes, by buying my books and sharing them, and by becoming patrons on patreon.com. Patronage not only bestows good karma, but also lists of the latest online resources in medieval studies and options to get both Medievalist.net and this podcast ad-free. To find out more or to become a patron, please visit patreon.com/medievalists. For everything from poet monks to elephant trunks, follow Medievalist.net on Instagram at MedievalistNet or Blue Sky at Medievalists. You can find me, Danièle Cybulskie, across social media at 5MIN Medievalist or 5 Minute Medievalist. And you can find my books at all your favorite bookstores. Our music is Beyond the Warriors by Frog. Thanks for listening, and have yourself an awesome day.